Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Online Ethics Center's Spring 2026 webinar series, Bringing Ethics into the Conversation. We'll just wait a few minutes to have everybody come into the room. We're so glad you're here with us, no matter where you are. Awesome. So my name is Azita Hirsa. I'm a senior lecturer in the Industrials and Systems Engineering Department at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. I teach some of my favorite classes and topics: management of engineering and technology, engineering ethics, ethics of modeling, and professional development. I'm the host of the Leaders in Action conversations at RPI, Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, and I am the past chair of the ASEE's Ethics Division. And I have proudly hosted the Online Ethics Center webinar since 2023. The Online Ethics Center, hosted at the University of Virginia, is a comprehensive digital repository dedicated to ethics education in engineering and science. Beyond providing valuable teaching and learning resources, the OEC cultivates a vibrant community of faculty, students, researchers, and professionals engaged in meaningful discussions on ethical issues. Check out our resources at onlineethics.org. Our webinar series explores engineering and science ethics within the interconnected realms of industry, government, and academia, the triple helix shaping technological and ethical advancement. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Michael M. Greenburg, a practicing attorney and former member and editor of the Pepperdine Law Review. As a narrative nonfiction author, he brings a lawyer's eye for detail and storyteller's ear for drama to his writings. Michael is the author of 5 critically acclaimed nonfiction books: Peaches and Daddy, A Tale of Scandal, Media Frenzy, and Moral Panic in the Roaring Twenties, The Mad Bomber of New York, the gripping story of a manhunt that paralyzed the city and gave birth to modern criminal profiling, The Court Martial of Paul Revere, which uncovers the forgotten military disaster that nearly eclipsed a founding father, This Noble Woman, the inspiring biography, and Myrtilla Minor and her fight to educate African American girls in the antebellum South, and The Great Miscalculation, the riveting account of the race to save New York City's iconic Citicorp Tower. Michael has been featured on NPR, Bloomberg, the Smithsonian Channel, Veritasium, and the Travel Channel. He has lectured at the New York Public Library, Boston Public Library, the U.S. Constitution Museum, and numerous historical and literary societies. His work reflects a deep belief in the relevance of history and in the stories that still shape how we see the world today. After Mr. Greenberg's talk, we will take questions. To ask a question, please type it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen rather than the chat box, and I'll read them to him. Audience members will not be able to use their mics or cameras. Please join me in welcoming Michael Greenburg. Thank you so much for being with us, Michael.
You're welcome, and thank you very much, Azita, for that very kind introduction. In the quiet of his Sebago Lake summer retreat, William LeMessurier soberly contemplates suicide. The celebrated structural engineer has performed a meticulous floor-by-floor, brace-by-brace analysis of the Manhattan skyscraper that bears his signature design, a design that he now believes is gravely flawed. His focus centers on the 30th story, where he suspects the bracing joints are most vulnerable to extreme winds. If those joints fail, so too will the rest of the tower. He nervously calculates the probability of a storm in New York strong enough to cause the bolts holding the 30th floor joints to stress to point of fracture. Through careful examination of weather records, he determines to his dismay that a 16-year storm could cause a catastrophic failure, a 1 in 16 chance. Well, staring blankly out the window of his island home and grimly aware that the Atlantic hurricane season is fast approaching, LeMessurier considers the prospect of professional disgrace, financial ruin, and the horror of a building collapse in the heart of New York City. I would like to thank the Online Ethics Center for Engineering and Science for inviting me this morning and for allowing me to share with you what I consider to be one of America's most intriguing and yet overlooked stories of the 20th century. It's the story of an iconic New York skyscraper, a hidden flaw, and the structural engineer who suddenly found himself facing a crisis that tested not only his career, but his very character. It's a story of ingenuity, ethics, and principle. Well, parenthetically, the back flap of the Great Miscalculation states that this is my 5th book. That is not entirely true. I wrote my first book in 1966. I was 9, and the name of the book was Mystery on Mars. It was a wonderful story filled with illustrations and chapters and a wild storyline, and I was tremendously proud of what I'd accomplished. I remember looking through the Boston telephone book for publishers, and I recall picking up the phone and calling Little Brown because I liked the way the name sounded. Well, the woman who answered was very nice, and I told her about my masterpiece, and I asked her if she'd be willing to publish it. I was 9, remember. She told me that if I could type up the manuscript and send it in, they would be happy to consider it. Well, convinced that I had just stamped my ticket to stardom, I ran to my mother and asked her to type up my book so I could submit it to Little Brown. Now, I love my mother dearly. She was a hardworking single parent at the time, and she had a lot on her plate. So, of course, she said no. Well, I was devastated, had no idea how to type, and so that was the end of my dream of authorship. Well, as the years went by, scarred as I was, I finished school, went to college, and did what most other frustrated and scarred individuals do. I went to law school, and it was there that my interest in writing was rekindled. So I suppose The Great Miscalculation is just the very long sequel to Mystery on Mars. It only took me 60 years to finish it. I first learned of William LeMessurier and the 1978 Citicorp engineering crisis, oddly enough, while exploring the life of Luis Zamperini, the subject of the book and motion picture Unbroken. Zamperini's story of courage and heroism inspired me and got me thinking about heroes in a different sense. Not all heroes make the front page. Some are flawed, unrecognized. Some simply do the right thing quietly without expecting applause. And then there are those rare individuals who admit a mistake, face the consequences, and still make a difference. With those parameters in place, I was only steps away from William LeMessurier. Now, LeMessurier passed away in 2007, but in the course of researching the story, I spoke with one of his daughters who kindly shared her personal memories of her father, both the man and the engineer. I also talked with several of his surviving colleagues who generously shared their recollections of the engineering flaw, along with technical details about the building and its design. Well, in the summer of 1978, the New York newspapers engaged in a citywide strike, and thus the crisis was, to LeMessurier's immense relief, sparsely covered by the press. It was not until 1995 when a freelance writer named Joe Morgenstern stumbled on the story, personally met with LeMessurier, and published an article about the crisis in the New Yorker. Joe was kind enough to share all of his files with me, including interview transcripts, notes, everything, and they proved invaluable in the writing of the book. After his death, LeMessurier's family donated his papers to the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Those papers contain many of the surviving documents, memos, records, and correspondence dealing directly with his design of the Citicorp Tower and the events of 1978. Well, thanks to these archives and the transcripts provided by Joe Morgenstern, William LeMessurier essentially tells his own story. Next slide, please. Azita?
Just give me 1 second. There seems to be a technical difficulty here for some reason. Our audience can't see the slides or partial slides. Let me see if I can try this again. Give me 1 second. No, it's not sharing. Just give me 1 second. Let me stop sharing and restart it and see what happens now. I apologize for this. Let's see. I'm hoping that this works. If someone can send me a message in the text and let me know in the let me just see what we got. Okay, all right, excellent. This works now. So we'll carry on. I apologize. Okay, there we go.
There we go. Right. Okay. So any discussion of the Citicorp Tower necessarily begins, ironically enough, with an old and crumbling Gothic church at the corner of 54th and Lexington. In the late 1960s, prior slide, Zita.
Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. I apologize.
St. Peter's Lutheran Church was facing a difficult reality. Its congregation was shrinking, the building was falling apart, and many churches were just leaving the city. But St. Peter's had a shrewd, forward-thinking pastor, Ralph Peterson, who saw something different. He recognized the value of the church's land and the continuing need for a spiritual presence in Midtown Manhattan. When Peterson learned that a real estate firm was quietly assembling the city block for some mysterious project and client, he immediately realized that the church property, integral to development of the block, was about to skyrocket in value. Well, many urged him to sell and move on, but Peterson held firm. He wanted to keep St. Peter's in the city right where it stood. Eventually, he discovered who the mystery client was, Citibank, by then known as Citicorp, and their plan for a massive high-rise development on the block. When approached by the bank's agents about purchasing the church property, Peterson bluntly informed them, "We aren't leaving." He insisted that any new development plans must accommodate the church in its present location, but he also recognized that his building was deteriorating. Negotiations were long and painstaking, taking years to complete. But in the end, they reached a creative solution. The old Gothic church would be demolished, and a new, architecturally distinct church would rise in its place. The church sold its land to Citicorp for $9 million. The bank then converted the block into a giant condominium and sold the corner back to the church as a separate unit. Well, the New York Times wrote, since St. Peter's real estate clout was equal to its moral clout, a little arm twisting might have been involved. Well, the final arrangement was overwhelmingly approved by the voting members of the congregation. In keeping with Peterson's vision of an architecturally independent building, physically separate from the skyscraper, it was stipulated that the airspace above about 2/3 of the new church's footprint would remain open and that no element of the bank's tower would encroach upon or interfere with the church building below. It seemed like a reasonable stipulation, but that unambiguous and seemingly innocuous requirement would set into motion an engineering predicament with potentially catastrophic consequences. Next slide, please. With the basic site constraints in place, work on the Citicorp Center design began. From the start, the architect chosen by the bank, Hugh Stubbins from Cambridge, Massachusetts, wrestled with the required location of the church as it affected the design of the skyscraper. You see, if the building's bottom columns were placed conventionally at the four corners, one column would literally pierce through the sanctuary of the new church, a total non-starter under the bank's agreement with Pastor Peterson. Knowing that the dilemma would require some skilled and creative engineering, Stubbins called on his friend and colleague, William LeMessurier, a structural engineer also of Cambridge, who had worked with him on many other design projects in the past. Next slide. Over lunch one afternoon, the two men considered various design possibilities, but ultimately decided that a cantilever of one corner of the building over the church could resolve the problem. As they talked further, Stubbins suggested, well, if they could cantilever one corner, why not two, three, or even all four? Well, to make this work, they recognized that the bottom support columns of the skyscraper would have to be massive and multiple stories in height. And more importantly, they would have to be located at the outside center of each wall rather than at the corners. Well, it was a bold and audacious proposal. To accomplish this, LeMessurier needed to develop a way to channel the structure's loads to the bottom columns. He began devising a rudimentary bracing system consisting of a series of structurally independent V-shaped chevrons, each multiple stories in height and intersected by mass columns vertically extending the full length of each side of the tower to the base. He famously drew his concept on a napkin as he lunched with Hugh Stubbins. Next slide. Through this groundbreaking use of supermodules, he insisted that wind and gravity loads could be gathered in increments and guided down via diagonal compression through the base truss and distributed to the main columns below. Simply put, whatever would be lost by the center placement of the base columns would be gained by this unique system of bracing support. This is a very efficient cantilever, LeMessurier later said. It is a mathematical ideal. Well, to this innovative and lightweight design, LeMessurier incorporated a first-of-its-kind tuned mass damper at the top of the tower, a 29-foot square, 8-foot thick, 400-ton yellow block of concrete set on a thin bed of oil designed to shift in opposition to the sway of the building. Importantly, the damper was intended only for the comfort of building occupants and not for the structural safety or integrity of the tower. Next slide. So with this complex engineering system agreed to, designed, and tested, construction of the tower began and progressed without incident. Upon its completion, the Citicorp Center was met with almost universal praise by the critics. On October 12, 1977, at the dedication of the Citicorp Center with Governor Hugh Carey and Mayor Abraham Beame in attendance, Hugh Stubbins called his creation a skyscraper for the people. The Citicorp Tower was perhaps LeMessurier's crowning achievement, and it became a catalyst for his career. His novel wind bracing system and innovative application of damping technology earned him international acclaim, and in February of 1978, he was inducted into the National Academy of Engineering, of course, one of the highest honors bestowed in his profession. Next slide. Well, in the fall of 1977, just a few months after dedication of the Citicorp Tower, a Princeton University engineering student named Diane Hartley began work on her senior thesis. Under the guidance of her supervisor, Professor David Billington, Hartley undertook a detailed study of the scientific, social and symbolic aspects of the new Citicorp Center in New York City. It was an ambitious project, one that would take her on a remarkable and ponderous journey. The final thesis included a detailed history not only of Citicorp Center, but of skyscrapers as an American institution. It encompassed 460 pages with 440 endnotes, 96 detailed plates, and 29 mostly hand-drawn technical figures in 2 leather-bound volumes. It was an extraordinary document. Next slide. Well, as part of her work, Diane Hartley had reached out to LeMessurier's office in Cambridge, who directed her to their engineering team in New York City. This was a day when nefarious motives such as terrorism and sabotage weren't quite yet immediately suspected. And so LeMessurier's New York engineers spoke openly with Hartley about the engineering of the tower, even sharing with her copies of the plans and calculations upon which its construction was based. Well, by mid-March, with the deadline for her thesis already extended, Hartley turned to the final critical phase of her analysis, testing the wind resistance of the Citicorp Tower. Her approach was methodical. She broke down the expected design stresses of the building and compared them to the actual calculations provided by LeMessurier's engineers. She began with the basics: the weight of the tower, its density, and its ability to withstand wind pressures at different heights. When she compared her calculations to the design stresses, her numbers aligned closely with those of the New York engineers. But there was one key assumption in those calculations. They only accounted for wind striking the tower straight on at a perpendicular angle. Now, at the time, New York City's building code, ambiguous as it was, did not explicitly require engineers to consider non-perpendicular winds in high-rise construction. Perhaps that was because lighter, more complex skyscrapers were still kind of a rather new phenomenon in the 1970s. Even LeMessurier himself later wrote that wind from diagonal angles just wasn't widely discussed or considered in engineering literature or in the classroom. But even as an undergraduate, Hartley intuited otherwise. In her thesis, she wrote, "The situation of a quartering wind must be examined in addition to that of wind striking full face." Next slide. So what exactly is a quartering wind? Well, as you may know, it's a wind that strikes the corner of a building at a 45-degree angle, thus impacting 2 sides at once rather than just one. So unlike a straight-on wind that presses against a single face, a quartering wind spreads its force across multiple surfaces, creating a very different and potentially more dangerous load on the structure. Well, Hartley ran the numbers. Using basic geometry, she calculated that while the force on any single face of the building in a quartering wind was only about 71% of that from a straight-on wind, the total wind load actually doubled because 2 sides were affected. The result being that the building would experience a 42% higher stress in quartering winds than in perpendicular ones. So this was a critical finding. She pored over the structural drawings and calculations, expecting to see some confirmation that the engineers had accounted for this effect. But she found nothing. No analysis of quartering winds, no adjustments for their impact on the building's unique column structure. Instead, the official wind stress calculations showed numbers significantly lower than what she was expecting. Were these numbers, were these preliminary figures, she asked herself? Had the real calculations been done later? She was down to the last 2 pages of her thesis, and she needed answers. Desperate for clarity, she went back to LeMessurier's New York engineers. "What am I doing wrong?" she asked. "Why don't my numbers match?" Well, she hesitated even making the call. LeMessurier's office was world-renowned, respected across the field of engineering. The Citicorp Tower was standing tall, praised, admired, an architectural marvel. I mean, put yourself in her position. Here she was, a student with no real experience, no credibility. Surely there had to be an explanation for the discrepancy. She explained that when it came to perpendicular winds, her numbers matched almost perfectly. But when she factored in diagonal winds, quartering winds, the stresses shot up far beyond what was reflected in the construction plans. What concerned her most was the odd placement of the building's main columns and their potential vulnerability to quartering winds. Well, nervously, she asked LeMessurier's engineer if maybe she had overlooked something. Well, the engineer calmly explained that she had nothing to worry about. Far from being a weakness, he told her, the tower's column placement actually made it more resilient in quartering winds. He described how in a conventional design where the columns are at the corners, only one column bears the brunt of a quartering wind, while another absorbs compression. The remaining two simply act as pivots. But Citicorp's columns weren't at the corners. Of course, they were set in from the edges. That meant two legs were working in tension and two in compression, creating a more balanced, efficient system for resisting these diagonal forces. Yes, he acknowledged, quartering winds do increase the load, but because of the tower's unique design, that load was better distributed. It simply wasn't a critical factor in evaluating this building's structural integrity. Well, Hartley was still a bit perplexed, but also very relieved. She just wanted to finish her thesis, graduate, and move on with her life. So she accepted the engineer's explanation without argument. Well, as it turned out, Hartley was right to this degree. Quartering winds did create more variable stress levels on parts of the tower than perpendicular winds, but the placement and strength of the columns themselves was not the real problem. As designed, those columns could withstand winds from any direction. However, the Citicorp engineers had failed to fully analyze the impact of quartering winds on every other structural component of the tower. Unbeknownst to Hartley, to LeMessurier, or to anyone else at the time, the building still harbored a hidden vulnerability to quartering winds, a subtle, overlooked feature that under the right conditions could cause wind forces to amplify in a way that no one had predicted. Now, ironically, at about the same time that Hartley was placing the finishing touches on her thesis, another student telephoned LeMessurier's Cambridge office and asked to speak with the engineer. Well, LeMessurier was an educator, and though he was in the middle of a meeting, he agreed to take the call. The student explained that he was a freshman architectural student in New Jersey and that his professor had assigned him a paper on the Citicorp Tower. The bottom columns, the student told LeMessurier, were, according to his professor, in the wrong place. Well, LeMessurier took great pleasure in describing the unique field conditions presented by St. Peter's Church that required the mid-face placement of the columns. And he explained that in a quartering wind, these columns actually performed even more efficiently than had they been placed at the corners. Tell your professor that, LeMessurier gloated. Only years later did the caller, who was named Lee DeCarolis, learn about the Citicorp engineering crisis and conclude that he was the student who may have set into motion LeMessurier's later discovery. Now, did LeMessurier's New York engineers communicate Diane Hartley's concerns to him? We simply do not know. Hartley never claimed to have spoken directly to LeMessurier, but she did correctly identify the general problem of quartering winds in the design of the Citicorp Tower. DeCarolis had never even heard of quartering winds. but it is reasonable to conclude that both Hartley and de Carolis contributed in some way to what would happen next. In the coming days, LeMessurier decided, with all these calls from students, that the placement of the Citicorp Tower columns and the design of his unique chevron bracing system would make a wonderful lecture topic for his engineering class at Harvard. And he began making some notes and calculations about the topic. Well, as LeMessurier began preparing his lecture notes, something nagged at him. A month earlier, while consulting on the plans for 2 new skyscrapers in Pittsburgh, he had learned that the member joints for the chevron bracing system on the Citicorp Tower had been secured with high-capacity bolts, rather than the stronger but more expensive welding process originally called for by the building plans. This was a change approved by his firm. It was a cost-saving measure. By itself, this was not unusual or concerning as a modification. It was more efficient option, a cost-efficient option, and if properly engineered, completely appropriate. Next slide. Well, as LeMessurier dug deeper into his calculations, he discovered what he later called some very peculiar behavior in his wind bracing system. He learned that inherent in the design of the chevrons, the stresses in 4 of the 8 bracing members in each module vanished to 0 in a quartering wind, but at the same time, they increased by 40% in the remaining 4. When the wind blew directly against the structure in a perpendicular direction, these diagonal braces remained compressed due to the combination of gravity and wind tension. But when the wind blew at an angle, certain of those braces partially unloaded from their compressed state in such a way that amplified the tension on them. Well, LeMessurier knew that if the overall chevron bracing system was reactive to quartering winds, then so too must be the splices that held that system together. He also knew that had the original specifications not been changed from full penetration welds for those splices, the bracing system would have provided more than ample resistance to winds from any direction. But with that change, the strength and capacity of the bolts that secured the connections instantly became a matter of unease, because he was certain that his engineers had not considered quartering winds in the design of those bolts. Again, he insisted that New York code only required consideration of perpendicular winds, and that analysis of diagonal winds was simply not part of the custom and practice of high-rise building design at the time. Although not yet in a panic, LeMessurier immediately went down to his New York office and reviewed all the shop drawings and calculations for the Citicorp bracing system. He quickly confirmed that indeed, quartering winds were not taken into consideration in the engineering of the bracing system splices. But he also learned to his dismay that instead of deducting only 75% of the actual gravity load in the building to offset wind tension, as was the conservative standard to preserve factors of safety, his team had deducted the full compression amount, 100%. In so doing, the engineers concluded that only 4 bolts per splice were required. Now, if the effect of a quartering wind is considered, the wind stresses will increase by 40%, as we've seen. That being the case, LeMessurier calculated, instead of 4 bolts, more than 10 bolts would have been required per splice. And had his team properly deducted only 75% of the gravity load to offset quartering wind tension rather than 100%, 14 bolts would have been needed. This thing is in real trouble, he began to think. At that point, LeMessurier traveled to Ontario, Canada, to meet with his wind tunnel experts to obtain up-to-date weather statistics and to reanalyze the Citicorp Tower based on the effect of quartering winds on the bolted bracing system. He took the raw data back to his island home in Maine and spent the weekend immersed in calculations and probabilities. To his dismay, he now concluded that his building could in fact collapse in a storm that could strike New York City once every 16 years, a 1 in 16 chance. Well, the reality of a cataclysmic structural failure began to possess him. LeMessurier was now faced with an impossible decision: remain silent and pray that the building could withstand a destructive storm, or endure the risk of professional disgrace, humiliation, and the legal consequences of disclosure. Both seemed unthinkable, and each forced him into a corner. Suicide actually did cross his mind. To be sure, that would have ended his present anxiety, but he had a family and a legacy that weighed on his mind. By the end of the weekend, his thoughts cleared and his only viable choice emerged. He would disclose his findings and face whatever consequences befell him. I had information that nobody else in the world had, he later wrote. I had power in my hands to effect extraordinary events that only I could initiate. Well, unable to reach the architect, Hugh Stubbins, LeMessurier first connected with Stubbins' lawyer and arranged a meeting. On the lawyer's advice, LeMessurier quickly notified his insurance carrier of the potential claim, and within 24 hours, he was in a New York conference room surrounded by insurance defense lawyers. The Citicorp Tower was observably sound and of worldwide architectural acclaim. They thought I was nutty, recalled LeMessurier. Nobody in his right mind calls up and says, my building is going to fall down. He nervously told the gathering, it doesn't take more than 10 minutes to realize that this is a disaster. He admitted that his office had failed to consider non-perpendicular winds in the design of the splicing bolts. The impact of quartering winds, he claimed, would not have been of any consequence had the original design of the welded connections and the diagonal bracing system been adhered to. But once those connections were converted to bolts, a change he insisted he was unaware of at the time, it fell upon his engineers to accurately design the capacity and strength of those bolts. He admitted that his office had failed to consider non-perpendicular winds in that design. The result, he told them, was a series of vastly overstressed bracing connections in the building. LeMessurier had prepared a streamlined summary of his calculations, and he circulated it among the lawyers. The Citicorp Tower, he told them, was in great danger. And he reminded the men that the hurricane season was fast approaching. Next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, thank you. To independently verify LeMessurier's concerns, the insurance company had called in an independent structural engineer by the name of Leslie Robertson, famed for his design of the Twin Towers in New York's World Trade Center. Robertson immediately confirmed to the group that given the findings presented, they were, in all probability, facing the imminent prospect of total collapse of the tower in severe winds. The next step, of course, was to notify the bank that its $193 million investment was in imminent and grave danger. Next slide. LeMessurier and Stubbins escalated the alarming news up the corporate ladder. They met with bank officers who listened carefully and then passed it along to the chairman. By day's end, the two men found themselves in front of one of the most powerful figures in American finance. Walter Wriston, the formidable chairman of Citicorp, was no ordinary banker. Widely recognized as the most influential financier of his era, he had the ear of presidents and the clout to move markets. Surprisingly, Wriston accepted the news calmly and began thinking about the public relations aspects of what would happen next. His mind was already formulating a press release that would not only advise the public, but also preserve the indelible reputation of his bank. LeMessurier had already developed a solution to the problem. A series of carefully engineered steel plates could be welded to both sides of each bolted connection like a splint to secure and reinforce the bolts. He'd created a detailed risk analysis of the tower and generated a priority schematic for the order of repairs to be conducted, with the sober understanding that if one of the bolted connections failed, so too would the others, with a calamitous result. In the following weeks, LeMessurier shuttled back and forth to New York, held endless meetings with engineers, steel fabricators, lawyers, and bank officers, even setting up a war room in Frank Sinatra's Waldorf Astoria suite while Sinatra was on tour. Robertson insisted that local and state authorities be notified of the problem and that remedial work was to occur. And the meetings with those officials also took place as required. A specialized firm from California was called in to wire the building with sensors to provide an advanced warning system of sorts in the case of untoward movement or instability. They have the tuned mass damper fine-tuned well beyond its intended specifications to accommodate as much as possible dangerous building sway, and they added an emergency generator to be activated in the event of power loss. Weather forecasters were hired to provide hourly tracking of adverse weather events along the East Coast, and the engineers were given personal beepers to alert them of any untoward movement of the tower. By all accounts, the engineers, technicians, bank officers, and bureaucrats worked side by side in a resolute and single-minded spirit of cooperation. To LeMessurier's chagrin, however, an emergency evacuation plan was developed by the bank with Les Robertson's assistance to be implemented by the Red Cross and local authorities that would, if activated, displace thousands of occupants, patrons, and neighbors from the area and provide aid and shelter as required. It was the step that LeMessurier feared would end his career. It was agreed that the remedial work was to be conducted during the evening hours in order to minimize the disruption to tenants in the building. Total secrecy was obviously impossible, but everyone involved did their best to downplay what was clearly a dangerous situation. A guarded and carefully calibrated public statement created and approved by Walter Wriston and the engineering team claimed that the purpose of the work was to strengthen the building as a matter of prudence in light of some new weather statistics rather than necessity. The objective was to reinforce the building as secretly as possible without panic or concern about the safety of the structure. LeMessurier later admitted, "We had to cook up a line of bull, and white lies at this point are entirely moral." While the Citicorp press release seemed only to heighten media curiosity rather than allay it, one evening, LeMessurier returned to his hotel room and was informed that a reporter from the New York Times had called. Filled with dread, he vacillated on what to do. But just after 6 o'clock, he picked up the phone and dialed the reporter's number at the Times. The call was answered by a recording stating that the New York Times had just gone out on strike. In point of fact, and to LeMessurier's enormous relief, every major newspaper in New York had joined the pressmen's strike. It would last through October. LeMessurier later said, "If the newspapers hadn't been on strike, I dread to think what would have happened. It would have been pure hell." It was, he said, the greatest thing that ever happened. Well, the work to save the Citicorp Tower continued throughout the entire summer of 1978 in the dead of night, in the absence of the watchful eyes of the New York press. With each corrective weld, the building was strengthened, and as the summer progressed, LeMessurier began to breathe somewhat easier. And then the weather changed. Next slide. As the team pushed through the final days of August, another force was gathering deep in the central North Atlantic. On August 28th, satellite imagery showed a cyclonic churning of low cloud elements about 480 nautical miles southeast of Bermuda. 36 hours later, it was a tropical depression, and it was headed west-northwest. When word of the storm reached the engineers, the team ramped up into full disaster readiness. Labor Day weekend was approaching, and the city was humming. By 6:30 a.m. on August 30th, the engineering team had already assembled at the Waldorf Command Center. They were deep into evaluating possible evacuation scenarios. Welding work was still underway. As LeMessurier admitted, we still weren't quite ready. That evening, the storm was given a name, Tropical Storm Ella, the fifth named storm of the 1978 hurricane season. By 9 p.m., the National Weather Service issued a warning in all caps. Satellite pictures indicate Ella is continuing to strengthen and could be a hurricane within 24 hours. They weren't wrong. Flight reconnaissance confirmed it. Ship reports echoed it. By the night of August 31st, Ella had become a hurricane heading toward the coast of North Carolina. Well, LeMessurier wasn't waiting to see if it would turn north toward New York. That possibility was obvious and terrifying. His jaw was throbbing. He was suffering with an impacted molar, aggravated by the ongoing stress of the situation. But the meetings had to go on. He sat with his team, with executives from the bank, evaluated the building's readiness. The question on everyone's mind, could the tower survive a direct hit from Ella? If the tuned mass damper performed as enhanced, and LeMessurier believed it would, the tower could withstand a 200-year storm at that moment. What kept him awake was a storm entering through the Narrows, its eye just west of Manhattan, hurling southeast winds directly at the tower. Ella, he feared, could be that storm. By Friday afternoon, September 1st, the storm was packing winds over 125 miles per hour, and the barometric pressure had dropped to 959 millibars. Robertson's private meteorologist updated the engineers nearly every hour. As Ella roared toward the Outer Banks, it began to track northward, up the coast, and toward New York. Everybody was sweating blood, LeMessurier later said. But then, on Saturday, September 2nd, a ridge of high pressure settled over the northeast, swiftly veering Ella north and away from the coast. It would go on to slam the Canadian Maritimes with winds of 140 miles per hour, the strongest storm to ever hit those waters. Next slide. By the end of the summer, work on the tower was complete. LeMessurier insisted that it could now withstand a 1 in 1,000 year storm, as strong and impervious as any high-rise building in the world. As Joe Morgenstern wrote in his 1995 New Yorker piece about the Citicorp drama, the crisis produced heroes, but no villains. William LeMessurier's actions are remembered not only for his innovative and cerebral approaches under unspeakable stress, but also as a refreshing example of professional ethics and integrity in the engineering industry and beyond. He did have his detractors, to be sure. After all, he had failed to properly oversee the engineering details of his building during the initial design, leaving all of that to his New York team. And he had engaged in a conspiracy of secrecy as to the real reasons for the corrective work. Wouldn't you have wanted to know the truth before you entered that building in 1978? Nevertheless, LeMessurier is almost universally revered for confronting the crisis at great risk to himself. As one commentator wrote, it may be LeMessurier's destiny to be known for the error he confessed rather than for the skyscrapers he designed. At no time in his professional life has LeMessurier ever been better respected. Well, today, 601 Lexington still stands as a silent testament to an engineer's courage and a lesson to all of us about the power of integrity. We live in a world built on invisible trust, don't we? Bridges, buildings, planes. This story reminds us how fragile that trust can be. I thank you very much.
Sorry about that. I was trying to unmute. Thank you so much. This was awesome. You've answered so many questions that we raise when we talk about this in the classroom. We have about 10 minutes, and I'm just looking to see whether we have any audience questions. So if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will answer your questions. I had a question. So as an educator, teaching ethics and teaching professional development to our students, given that you've written this awesome book, what advice do you have? How do we as educators facilitate? How do we, get more of our engineers to be like LeMessurier?
Read my book.
That too.
Uh,
But I mean,
um,
I guess are engineers with integrity and this level of conscientiousness, are they born or are they made? What are your thoughts?
right. It's funny. A few months ago, excuse me, I'm losing my voice a bit. A few months ago, I addressed a group of students at NYU, and kind of the same question. The professors were there as well, and there was this trepidation among the professors
Mm,
of kind of like, do they get it? Do they understand the import? I think you there's a section in my book that talks about um, the history of failures, building
mm,
failures. And I think it's important that the engineering community be painfully aware of what those what the ramifications of those failures can be. I think in the Kansas City Hilton disaster, the collapse of the Hilton, they brought um, they brought a licensing claim against the structural engineers who ultimately did lose their license to practice. Um, but that was appealed to the appeals court, and the appeals court said the level of the legal duty of an engineer rises in proportion to the amount of harm that his or her structural design can cause. So I think that's something to bear in mind as well. Um, but not being an engineer maybe helps me in this regard because I would just counsel people to know worst case scenarios.
yeah, yeah. I've got two great questions from the audience. One from Richard Burke, and I know we talk about this, in terms of stakeholders. Who are the people that should be responsible? And of course, you talked about the measure and all the other folks that work with him. Question is, did New York City ever modify their codes? Clearly, they own part of the responsibility for this problem. So first, do you agree? And second, that has that happened?
They did. First of all, the code was ridiculously ambiguous because it said, I believe it said something like winds need to be considered from every direction. Okay, so they look northeast, south, west. They didn't construe that to mean um, hitting multiple sides of a structure at the same time. I think that did change, but not for years afterwards. It was time, but I could tell by the classroom had changed because Diane Hartley was aware of it.
Mhm, mhm.
She was the one that couldn't. She was perplexed by this. So maybe LeMessurier, as great an engineer as he was, maybe he just needed a refresher course. And of course, more importantly, with LeMessurier, he needed to be more hands-on, and he admitted this. He needed to be more hands-on with his New York engineering team. They were young engineers, and they were tasked with taking this vision and this innovative wind bracing system and turning it into reality. And LeMessurier was by then he was in Iran setting up new offices. Um, and enjoying his new international acclaim. And so I think he needed to be more of a big picture engineer and be more attentive to work being done on his behalf.
Yeah, this is a great segue into this next awesome question that an anonymous attendee asks. What kind of character strengths do you think William LeMessurier demonstrated, and how do you think he developed those strengths? I know you
So
said you talked to his daughter. Did you get a
yeah,
sense?
yeah. LeMessurier is he's a very complex individual. He's ego driven, but at the same time, he's fragile. Um, um, Perhaps subject to depression,
Mhm.
eccentric. I think I describe him as endearingly eccentric. Um, and he had past experiences. One of those was he didn't, I don't believe he served in the military. And I think he had he mentioned in the transcripts that he had some guilt about that. He also was a family man, and he knew that if he did not do the right thing in this matter, what his children think of him years later when they looked into it? Well, that building collapsed, but Bill LeMessurier had the knowledge to prevent it. So um, I mean, it took courage on the one hand, but on the other hand, what would anybody in this room who I'm addressing now, would anybody seriously not divulge in order to protect themselves? So, I mean, it takes courage, it takes integrity, and it takes professionalism. And I think LeMessurier demonstrated all of those. Um, he tried to balance that, and so did the bank, against the risk of bad press. And that's why he was
Mhm.
so happy about he was so happy about the newspaper strike. But I think he was um, just glad that he was able to escape from this unscathed. And as a matter of fact, more revered than ever before. So
Yeah,
it it,
yeah,
it proves that at least in this case, doing the right thing, he was certain it was the end of his career. He thought
yeah,
it was going to destroy him. So those were the stakes at that time.
yeah, yeah.
And the way it worked out, the exact opposite happened. So
Yeah, yeah. The one thing that you said that definitely, kind of brings up a red flag or lights up for me is the fact that he was so complex. And so while we talk about what he was revered yet and he had a lot of integrity and such, I wonder whether that was part of the network of people that were around him that kind of persuaded him in some way, to take those next steps. Had those other engineers, those PhD students, had they not been there, had they not voiced the concerns, would he have even considered to go back and look at it? Did it matter who actually talked to him and what they said to him, those conversations?
dramatically, Azita, because he wouldn't have known.
Yeah, yeah, that
It
too.
was the
Yeah, yeah.
students, it was the students who became the catalyst for his investigation. Would he have done that kind of detailed analysis? It was, coincidentally, at the time that he sat down to do those calculations, he had been working on the Back Bay Hilton in Boston, which is essentially a triangular building. So, where's the orthogonal direction? I mean, so his mind at that time was focused on quartering winds. So a lot of things kind of, um, it was a confluence of events and
Yes,
facts
yeah, yeah.
that caused him to look deeper into this and discover this. Had he not who knows?
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
leave that to you.
Yeah, thank you. We have three other questions. Do you have a few more minutes to ask answer those questions?
Sure.
Okay, all right. So, Jesse Papa says Lemonster clearly violated his code of ethics by conspiring to withhold critical information. How do you negotiate this tension in my ethics classes if we are to consider him an ethical exemplar?
So I believe there's an actual code um, in the code of ethics that addresses this. I don't have it with me, but it's a balancing act because on the one hand, you do not want to unnecessarily alarm the public. And there's a definite interest in that. But you have to weigh that against the public's right to know. So, I mean, you look at people will vary in their opinions about whether LeMessurier should have been more forthcoming here. Um, I think the biggest ethical flaw, the most egregious one, was that press release that really just made it sound like, yeah, we got some new weather information, and it's a matter of prudence. We're going to tighten it up. Nothing to see here. Uh,
Yeah, right.
so yeah, this is the questioner hits a very important point. And I am sorry I can't really give you a good answer because it's a balancing act. It's you just have to weigh your obligation not to panic the public unnecessarily against the public's right to know of a structural flaw that could affect public safety. In this case, I think that line was crossed. I think he should he and almost all of the literature now does question whether LeMessurier should have been more, or downright states that he should have been more forthcoming with information. But the bank was calling the shots as well, and they didn't want the black eye. This was their signature new building in the New York City skyline. All of a sudden they didn't want this this black eye, so to speak. There's something wrong with your building. It's your signature structure in New York. So
Yeah, yeah, no, and that's a great point because we often have that as a debate in our class with the students. And one of the stakeholders that doesn't come up is, in fact, the banks and how much of a reputation is at stake. So thank you so much. So my next question is, Daniel Thomas asked, you just mentioned how Lemercier thought he needed to be more hands-on with his engineering team. He insisted that he was not aware of the change from welded to bolted plates. Did you uncover any more details about how this missed his oversight?
how this what his oversight?
He did any more details about how this missed his oversight?
Yeah. So Daniel, it's a great question because um, it is his engineers in New York were young and they were very capable and they all went on to wonderful careers as engineers. But LeMessurier did need to provide much more oversight because the the plan was was unique. This chevron bracing system was um, it had never really been used. It was based upon Fazlur Khan's design of the Chicago John Hancock Tower. I think it had X bracing.
Mhm.
Well, he used that concept, but set it up as chevron bracing. Um, um, but it was fairly unique. So you can't just take that concept and kind of throw it in the hands of your employees and say, make this happen. And he freely admitted that that was, that was
Mhm.
his major mistake in all of this. And, could some of these things have been corrected had he been more hands-on? We don't know because LeMessurier was not a quartering wins guy, as we know. So
Right.
did I answer the question? Was there more to that question?
Yeah, no, that was all I have, Daniel. If you're still online and if you have further questions as backup, please go ahead and put them in the chat in the Q&A box. So thank you. Nikita has a question. Nikita Harry says, "Great talk. Thank you. Is ethics in engineering universal or shaped by cultural and societal contexts? Can we teach a single version of ethics in a globally diverse engineering classroom?"
I'm not sure I know how to answer that question. I mean, the answer has to be yes, because um, culture um, must inform ethics. I mean, what is um, uh, what is an ethical standard in one community? Um, and I'll pose it in the form of a question. Should an ethical standard in one community be universal? I'm just restating her question. I mean, should a different culture have a different set of structural standards to the extent that the building codes in that community differ, or the structures differ? I mean, if we're talking about grass huts in a remote area, well, I suppose the ethical considerations may vary from, Hong Kong, New York City, Singapore, wherever. So I am I think that's the subject of a whole new book that
Yes, absolutely is.
I'll have to think, or maybe the questioner can go ahead and begin work on that book. That's a good one.
Yeah, well, we have just asked you to now commissioned you to write part two of this book. Nikita, that was a fantastic question. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for asking it. And Daniel says thank you. That does largely answer it. I have to admit, I did read your book and I finished it 2 weeks ago, and so I want to thank you for being with us. It was an absolute pleasure to hear you talk about this. I'd love to have you back. If you have more questions, please send them my way. Everybody who's in the audience, I see there are faculty members, there are students, and thank you for accepting to be here. Thank you for educating us and filling in all the gaps when we go into the classroom and we're not, well, I don't know the answer. So you certainly enlightened me quite a bit, and I have so many questions that I want to ask you after reading the book, but we don't have a whole lot of time, so maybe we'll bring you back at some other point. So thank you again.
Reach
Um,
out anytime. Reach out anytime, and it was my pleasure. And thank you so much.
Absolutely. So, to everyone in the audience, I want to thank you for being here. And again, thanks so much, Michael, for joining us. The OEC's director, Dr. Rosalind Byrne, and coordinator, Tracy Marshalls, which you met early on. Without her, none of this would be possible technically and administratively. And to all of you for joining us, we hope to see you at our next session, and have a great, wonderful weekend, and stay warm if you're in cold weather. And Michael, we hope that we'll see you back again. Thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.